Hi, my name is Bridget Heap, and I'm a research associate with Feed My Sheep Foundation.
Good evening, everyone. My name's Carrie McMillan. I also work with Bridget at Feed My Sheep.
Well, thank you so much for joining us for part one of our back to school webinar for 2023. Tonight, my colleague Carrie is going to walk us through a document which was issued by the New York State Department of Education this past June. Now, this document is entitled Creating a Safe, Supportive, and Affirming School Environment for Transgender and Gender Expansive Students. And this is their 2023 legal update and best practices document. Now, before she dives into this document, though, and explains why it's so concerning, I just want to mention that this is a live webinar. So if you have any questions or comments, you can post those in our comment section on our Facebook or our YouTube feed, and we are going to do our best to try to get to those questions. All right, Carrie, so are you ready to dive into this document?
Yeah, let's do it. So this is going to be a slightly different format than our previous webinars. We're just really going to walk through this document together and have a conversation about it. That's something that parents really need to be aware of because this is the guidance provided from New York State Education Department to schools on the gender issue. So it's something that we at Feed My Sheep have been dealing with for a long time, trying to summarize the different things happening in schools. And New York State Education Department did it for us and really put it all together in one place and is showing what's happening in the public schools related to gender ideology. So this is the document here that you can see. I've downloaded it and added a little bit of highlights. Other than that, I have not added or edited anything. So you'll just see areas where I've highlighted in the PDF. But we're just going to look through this together. So going to scroll down here. The acknowledgement section, we're not going to spend any time going through because we know that if this is guidance to support the transgender movement, certainly it's going to have some woke voices that we're going to have some concerns with. And we're not really going to focus on the people behind it this time. We have had those conversations in previous presentations, but we're just more going to focus on what is being said. But I am going to pause here. So I am a permanently certified New York State school counselor. I worked in the public school for several years before deciding to leave. And now I work primarily with adults. But when I was working in the school, these documents that came down from state ed were essentially treated like gospel, right? So as a counselor, one of my responsibilities was navigating graduation requirements. And if we had a new guidance document put out from New York State Ed, that's what we would follow. We would go to trainings put on that guidance document and using that for our school population. And we would follow that to the T to make sure that we were doing what we were supposed to for our students. So my concern is that certainly this is going to be taken that same way, taken as gospel, taken as truth, and basically of how to handle these issues. Yet they give this disclaimer. So we saw on that first page, it said it was a legal update, but here they mention that the schools should evaluate each resource to determine if it's developmentally and age appropriate for their school, that this state ed does not endorse any program cited herein, but they do recommend them in here. So again, this is just a legal disclaimer. That this does not represent official determinations or interpretations, that it does not necessarily represent an official legal opinion. So all of this to say, I think this is really just to protect state ed in case there's an issue of interpretation of these laws. But I would use it to say, if you are working in the schools and you take issue with some of the content in this guide, this is a disclaimer saying this is not officially legal opinion. So do what you think is right to determine developmental and age appropriateness for your school population. And don't necessarily take this as the gospel that I at least previously did when I received these types of documents in the past. So hopefully that's an encouragement that though we're going to look through and be shocked and probably very unhappy with some of the things written in here, we also should be bold to do what we think is right and what's appropriate for our students.
And Carrie, I'm glad you brought that up because in many cases I've heard teachers asking, well, what can I do and what can't I do? Like kind of where's the line? And so this is opening up the possibility then for teachers to say that we don't think that this is appropriate for our students in our school and that they can work in a sense a different direction. So I appreciate you pointing that out.
I think so. And the reality of that happening, I'm not sure, but I would want that
Mhm.
to be the case, that people would feel encouraged to do that. I think more likely, people will skip right by that and on to the rest of the content as we are going to do now, but and just focus on, especially when it comes from administration, it feels like as other staff members, it feels like there may not be much you can do. But certainly there are many teachers across our country standing up against some of this ideology right now, and many times winning court cases in their favor as well. Um, so let's dive in here. My overall impression of this whole document is that New York State is forcing a dangerous pseudoscientific and spiritual belief on all students and employees in New York State public schools. So if you have not watched our other videos or presentations and you're not aware of gender ideology, the tenets of it, the harms associated with it, then I highly recommend that you do that you watch some of Bridget's presentations, some other videos we have on our website, because we're not really going to spend a lot of time talking about all the harms of gender ideology in this conversation tonight. We're just going to focus on what are the schools being told? How is this gender ideology permeating the school districts in New York State? So that's going to be the focus tonight. So like I said, this essentially puts together all of the concerning laws and perspectives that parents have individually been tackling and thrust this summary into the hands of the public school employees to ensure everybody's on board with this extreme gender ideology. Okay, so this start here on this introduction is using a National School Climate Survey from Gleason, which is an activist LGBTQ organization. So they're the ones that are promoting and pushing for gender and sexuality clubs in schools and for curriculum that teaches gender ideology. They are one of the main activist organizations that we'll see involved in the push for this content being in our schools. And so they did a survey. So we assume, of course, that it's going to be biased, but nonetheless, we agree with Gleason and some of their findings. We agree that kids should be treated with dignity and respect. And we agree that today's kids are often hurting. Where we disagree, which is extremely important, is that the information that they've found through their surveys is being manipulated to promote an untrue ideology that's essentially causing more harm to those same hurting students. And we disagree with their proposed solution that essentially we must just affirm all of these ideas that are hurting our kids. And not only just affirm, but promote and encourage these beliefs and thought processes and actions that cause more and more mental disruption, which is really just growing untamed and spreading like wildfires in our teenage population. Okay, so this next section of the document goes through different laws that are in New York State and a couple, well, at least one nationwide here, that address the gender issue in schools. So the first one is the New York State Human Rights Law, amended by GENDA, which you may have seen in the news over the past few years. Essentially, it prohibits discrimination by schools or educational institutions against students based on actual or perceived sex, gender identity, expression. So essentially, this was one that eliminated access to private spaces for girls and boys. That essentially anybody can use any facility and take any class, and essentially there is absolutely no separation based on sex, because that could be seen as discrimination based on gender identity. So if a male believes that they are a female, they can use the little girls' rooms in schools and so forth. So that is one of the laws that they mention here. The next is the Gender Recognition Act, which essentially added the fact that you can have X as a gender on identity documents. New York State education law is, again, prohibiting discrimination based on sex. They list here an interpretation that this includes gender identity and expression. And I went to what they're referencing, and it does not say that. It says based on sex, and that's it. And I looked this up and spent some time, and I think that this is simply their interpretation that it includes gender identity, and that's being based on the Biden administration's interpretation of Title IX, which is down here. Let's actually skip to that since we're talking about it. So Title IX is long prohibited discrimination based on sex. So that's why we've had separate sports teams for women. And with Title IX, like female athletic participation skyrocketed. And now we're seeing that the Biden administration is recommending an interpretation that sex includes gender identity. So they're saying essentially that anybody can join any sports team or gym class or anything that's separated based on sex, based on their identity and what they choose to identify as, rather than their biology, which is essentially making, obviously, women's sports essentially disappear because now men can be competing with women. Going back up, one thing more to mention about that. There are some states that are blocking that interpretation, mine included. I live in Alabama now. And that is obviously real exciting that states are taking it upon themselves to block this interpretation and protect separate spaces for men and women and separate athletic teams and so forth. The Dignity for All Students Act, or the Dignity Act, is essentially a no bullying, no harassment policy or law. I was the Dignity Act coordinator for my school district for some years, and I was actually quite happy to do that for some time because I certainly wanted to help prevent discrimination and harassment. That turns out that that's not really what this has been about. Of course, that's part of it, but it seems like it's just been a major gateway to promote this gender ideology because gender was listed as a protected group. And then they went back in and added to this law and added examples of bullying and discrimination, which include using someone's name and pronoun that they don't necessarily want to go by. So I spent some time thinking about this, and, certainly it could be bullying if you're taunting someone, right? So maybe a girl that thinks or believes to be a boy, and you're like, you're a girl, she, and you could definitely bully somebody with that. I sure do hope that that's what this is meaning and that it's not going to be used to just compel speech, but that is certainly wishful thinking. And I believe that there's in New York State, and based on all the information in here, you're going to see that school staff and students are more than heavily pushed, essentially forced to use anybody's chosen name, pronouns, despite what sex they are. And that certainly flies in the face of many people's religious beliefs and convictions. And this is being challenged in courts across our country right now. So a recent article actually that came out last week summarized all the different legal battles over pronoun use that are happening in the country right now. And in general, I'd say most of the ones I've seen have landed in people's favor who are saying, I'm not going to participate in that. But it has gone both ways. Okay, so this next section on terminology. So Bridget and I have spent a lot of time talking about how people who control the language control the culture. And this is so much more significant than just defining terms that are going to be used later in the document. This is defining terms that are changing the fabric of our schools and changing the fabric of our society. And you probably see this yourself as adults. So I know I have in workplace or in different forms I've had to fill out, being asked what my preferred name is or what my certain pronouns are, how I identify, things like that. And it really is shifting our culture to just accept this ideology as truth. So one thing I'll point out is affirmed name versus assigned name. So a firm name is something that's validated by the person. Essentially, it's their chosen or preferred name and their actual name that was thought out by their parents and selected based on, beliefs or history or family meaning and all of this by their parents is just an assigned name, and it's certainly losing value with this shift in culture, and we're moving to just whatever the individual chooses. Main one I want to point out here is this gender identity definition. So let's just read that together. It's one's innermost concept of self, how one perceives and identifies themselves, including but not limited to male, female, trans, transgender, queer, non-binary, gender non-conforming, or gender expansive. Gender identity can exist on a spectrum where some individuals feel entirely male, some entirely female, some somewhere in between, some a blend of both, and some neither. One's gender identity can be the same or different from their sex assigned at birth. Gender identity is a mental, emotional, and spiritual state, which is not determined by a person's external anatomy. So, wow, this is an extreme perspective, and it's even stated to be a spiritual state. It's certainly not something that's found to be based in science, that is not based in perceived reality. It's not based in any Christian religious beliefs. Of course, it's antagonistic to that and many other religions. And yet this is just being written in as if it's true, that this is just how it is, that gender identity is a spectrum now, and that people can identify however they want, and it's spiritual and it's emotional and it's just completely unrelated to their sex. So this is very much a concern.
Yeah, and I find this very concerning too, simply because our nation was founded on the principle of the separation between church and state,
Mm-hmm.
meaning that the state can't come in and say, this is our religion in this nation. They can't do that. And yet I feel like this is getting really close to that happening, because here they're acknowledging that this is a spiritual state, and they're essentially saying everybody has to affirm that. We're affirming this in our schools. We are changing the fabric of our schools in order to affirm this ideology, and yet they're admitting that this is a spiritual perspective. And so I do find that very concerning, even at that level too, that the state is pushing this.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a really good point, Bridget. All right, I mean, there's so many here. We could spend honestly hours discussing this document, and I'm going to try not to tonight. I'm going to try to keep it more timely. One other one I wanted to point out was this transgender person. So something that they say in here is that it's someone who is, for example, assigned male at birth and grew up to be a female, or someone who was assigned female at birth and grew up to be a male. So much to unpack there. First of all, we are not assigned our biological sex. It's not something that's just assigned to us. It's something that is part of every single viable cell in our body is our sex. So it's not just assigned to us like, oh, what should this person be? What should that person be? Oh, we're going to guess, like some childhood books are now saying it's a guess that doctors and parents make. It's not a guess. It is in every single viable cell of the human body. It controls the development of different systems within the body, of our brain, and how we function. A lot of differences between males and females. Yet this belief system now is saying that you can be assigned one thing and grow up to be something different. I remember reading one story. It was a news story about a young classroom. I think it was kindergarten, and the teacher read this book about being transgender and was celebrating somebody in the classroom who was transgender in kindergarten, and the kids all went home just terrified that they were gonna grow up to be a different gender, and like they didn't know what was going to happen to them. So it's just this really unusual, strange, metaphysical, like it's just not something that's based in reality at all, yet it's something that we're just stating can be true, that you can be female and grow up to be a male. That's just not how the human biology functions. It's also just concerning because this is really messing with, it's destroying really a child's sense of truth, their sense of believing their senses and believing their parents, and leading to more destruction than that, certainly including their bodies. Which leads us to this next definition. they use, I just highlighted here, gender affirming surgeries. They use that language throughout. And I just didn't want to skip over that. That's not just a little thing to throw in there. We see it probably in the news and so forth, that these surgeries and treatments are being called gender affirming. And that is just so political and manipulative and untrue. This is a really strong both political stance and honestly medical stance to take. These surgeries and hormone treatments are not affirming to a child in any way. As a matter of fact, they're destructive to children, and they're causing a wealth of harms physically, emotionally, mentally for these children for the rest of their lives. And it's actually coming out to research is showing that this is destructive and not beneficial. And other countries are starting to change their stance and not allowing children to go through these therapies and treatments until they're adults and so forth, because of how damaging it can be and how it's just not the right treatment for someone who's experiencing some gender confusion. So this is very concerning that that's the perspective New York State is pushing into the schools, is that this is a good thing. Okay, this next section is on understanding the climate related to this gender issue. And similar to the intro where we talked about that study by Gleason, they mentioned some more statistics and research suggesting just the negative experience that individuals who experience some gender confusion are experiencing. And similar to before, I want to just say here that we do believe all people should be treated with dignity and respect and should be loved. My concern with what is being listed here is not with that. Of course, I believe that. More so, my concern is with how the data is being manipulated to promote a certain agenda. So one thing that's suggested here is that the victimization of trans people is what is causing any negative health outcomes. So you can see here, studies shown LGBTQ youth experience much higher rates of depression, anxiety, alcohol, drug use, lower self-esteem as compared to their non-LGBTQ peers. And then they go forward to explain that they believe that it is a cause and effect relationship because of their victimization. And they cite this minority stress model, which if you go into the research, it had nothing to do with transgenderism. It was more the sexual orientation side of things. And it was completely theoretical, and it was based in critical theory. And so that's something that, was just concerning here, that they're using that to determine causation. And certainly it's theoretical and not very well based. But something I wanted to point out here that is one of my main concerns about this is cause and effect is really hard to determine, right? Certainly, an individual could be victimized and would have self-esteem issues, of course. But my concern is that that's not in general what I believe to be happening right now in this population. One thing to point that out is, for example, people who have autism spectrum disorder, children, are 8 times more likely, 8 times, to identify as transgender. So do we really believe that their trans identity and the victimization they experience because of that has caused their autism? Of course not. That's absurd. That's ridiculous. And so we really have to think about this cause and effect that's being purported here, and think about some of these health issues that this population is experiencing may also be causing some of this trans identity. And so similarly, people with ADHD are 7 times more likely to exhibit gender variance. So again, is the trans identity causing the ADHD? Or is there something about a person's experience with their mental health or their development that is causing them to be more likely to identify this way and maybe more susceptible to social contagion, which we find in the research right now with especially this rapid onset gender dysphoria. So just wanted to point that out and mention that was very concerning, because ultimately this belief that if a child comes out as trans or has this gender confusion, that is now the priority, and we need to affirm and support. We're taking a symptom of a mental health issue and affirming that, rather than getting to the root cause of what's happening and providing the appropriate treatment and love and healing for that mental health or developmental issue. So very, very concerned about this section. Yes. Okay. Something else to point out here in the same section, they bring up the suicide issue. It does appear that the transgender population has higher rate of suicidal ideation and or attempts. This data is pretty complicated to sort through, but let's say that is true, and it does appear to be true. This is being used essentially as emotional blackmail, as is the rest of this document. You can see quotes of children talking about how they just want to be normal. Again, some emotional manipulation and blackmail, but especially with this transgender issue, we hear doctors and teachers and counselors saying, like, would you rather a dead son or a live daughter? Like, encouraging that parent to let that child transition to save their life, when that's not what we find. So one long-term study in Sweden, which is a largely LGBTQ affirming country, suggested that adults who underwent sex reassignment surgeries were 20 times, almost 20, it was about 19 point something, more likely to commit suicide than the general population. This was after their surgeries. And so the surgeries, these affirming treatments, they're not helping the mental health issues. And so the people who are saying that right now, it's just, like I said, emotional blackmail, and it is absolutely not helping our children. The reality is that other studies show, and there's a range of numbers depending on the study, it seems like there's some consensus that between 80 and 98% of children who have some gender confusion in their younger ages will come to accept their biological sex and be completely comfortable in that sex by adulthood. And that's if they're not affirmed in this gender confusion. So most kids grow out of it if they're loved and affirmed as the person they are in their biological sex. And most, well, I shouldn't say most, that's not the right version of the word, but people who do transition and have surgeries are 20 times more likely to commit suicide. So we have the opposite approach here in this document, is what would be helpful for our kids. Going for time's sake here, they mentioned, of course, being a blend of genders. You can have neither gender. Again, these are things that just are completely emotional and spiritual, as they say. Nothing that's actually biological or found with brain development or found in physicality. So it can be nothing that anyone can dispute. If a child says this, it's simply emotional and spiritual. So they are the only ones who can possibly know their true identity. That's what's being communicated here. That says it right here. Individual students, the sole person who will establish their identity. It can even be flexible over time. I did have a student who decided that they were going to be a girl or a boy every day. That seemed to be a fad that they went through. And so according to this document, staff are expected to go along with each day what that child wants and change that in their school record systems and a whole range of things. And that child can use girls or boys' bathrooms, be rooming overnight with girls or boys, all depending on what they choose that day that they want to be.
And Carrie, I'll just say here too that just seems like a lot of undue pressure being put on staff and teachers to accommodate this. I mean, I have a theater class. I teach kids ages 6 to 18, and you know, I kind of have to memorize two names for each kid, their regular name and their stage name. And that can be a lot. I can't imagine what it's like for some of these teachers who have several classes, and over the day they might be teaching and interacting with hundreds of students, and then to have this fluid sense of what are you calling them and addressing your students throughout the day. That just seems like a pressure that just shouldn't be put on teachers and staff.
Yeah, absolutely. And especially with the tone of this document, as we'll see later on, where it says, like, if you use a child's like incorrect name, it can be harmful to them. And as we saw earlier, it can be perceived as bullying and harassment. So we really, this document is all about whatever a child says everyone around them and all of the adults have to come behind the child and use the child's terms, the child's name, whatever the child says to be true about their identity, and just affirm, no challenging allowed, because that's harmful to their mental health. So it's concerning, especially as we talked about, that this can be almost a symptom of a mental illness. So it's, again, just affirming is not the right way to go. All right, so this next section is on just the transition, and I just will point out here again that they are pro-medical transitioning in this document that's provided to schools, and it says that the decision for a student to access gender-affirming medical treatment is left up to the student, their parent, guardian, and their medical care team. School personnel may provide an affirming space for these students to share their opportunities, challenge, and aspirations. So that perspective of the school must be affirming. Again, that's what we're being told, is that the school will only affirm. Well, for many parents who have struggled with their children being caught up in this rapid onset gender dysphoria, and their child goes to school, and to know that it's only going to be an affirming environment, no matter what that child says, when they know that this is not good for their child, it's just a really dangerous place to be for some kids right now in the schools.
It's heartbreaking for parents too.
Yeah, absolutely heartbreaking. Yeah, I mean, schools used to be a trusted place where we could send kids. Yeah, not so much anymore. One thing I did want to point out, I was actually a little happy in this section that, though it's still not good, I was actually happy to see that they weren't promoting any medical facilities within the school to have access essentially for hormone treatments and so forth for the children, because that is happening in some schools. Have you even seen, there's some local groups to upstate New York where there's some medical facilities, I guess, coming into the schools. And so there's going to be access to these gender affirming sex change treatments, these dangerous therapies, right in the school building. So I was happy to see at least that they didn't say that this should be a part of the schools, though they do say medical care team, and that's just what they're going to consider those. They're going to consider them the medical care team. But yeah, so unfortunately, there's really no room here to be anything other than affirming. That's the biggest concern in that section. So this next section, coming out at school, essentially, again, it's telling the school that all we need is what the child says, nothing else. So schools personnel's acceptance of a student's asserted gender identity should require no more than a statement from the student expressing their preference. Schools do not need to require permission, letters from professionals, or other proof of identity. And this is the beginning of where this is repeated. I don't even know how many times, just countless times throughout here, where essentially it's like nothing else but what the child says is what the school needs to change school records, to, we're going to go forth and see, to deceive parents, to change what everyone in the school calls them, to change their access to bathrooms, to change their access to who they stay overnight with on overnight field trips. Just whatever the child says, nothing should be required. And if something is asked for, like a letter from a counselor or something, that is perceived as harassment and discrimination. It's just whatever the kid says is what's to go. One example they use here about Aaliyah. So I will just read this. Aaliyah is a transgender girl, but decides not to come out at school except to a few friends. Therefore, in the school's database, her name is Alfonso, and her gender marker is designated as male. So Aaliyah is a male named Alfonso who believes that he is a girl. So that's the transgender girl language for those who aren't familiar. During high school, Aaliyah asks a trusted teacher and classmates to call her by Aaliyah. The teacher uses Aaliyah and she, her to address a student in class, but uses Alfonso, he, him, when talking to other staff, faculty, and her parents. Aaliyah goes her entire high school career without telling most teachers about her name and pronouns. So this example is directly telling the teacher to deceive the parents, not just to not mention it to the parents, but to actually use a different name to the parents and other staff and faculty. and really protect that child's transgender identity. So this is not the only place it's mentioned. So for those who are like, oh, it's just one example, it might not be what it's saying. No, you will see time and time and time again throughout this document, it encourages the school to not tell the parents, to actively deceive parents. So not just don't let them know, but if you do talk to them, make sure you don't use the name, make sure you don't accidentally let it slip. It's not your job. So it's just over and over again, starting here. State Ed is declaring war on parents, saying we will not involve you in your child's mental health, identity. I mean, these are extremely important things.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting too that you've repeated it so many times that the child is the one kind of dictating what's happening, and yet we have laws and rules in places so that kids don't dictate their decisions on things. I mean, we have an age for driving, an age for buying lottery tickets, an age for getting cigarettes, an age for voting, and there's a reason for that because kids aren't developmentally ready to make those types of significant cognitive decisions and making those wise decisions. And so this just seems really chaotic then that they're saying kids can make these decisions in this case.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And, I think as we go forward, we'll see. So, in this example, it talks about coming up with a plan with a student. If they do come out as transgender, to support them and know what names we should call you, what documents are going to be changed, what bathrooms do you want, sorts of things. But it says here again, the parents can be involved if given permission by the student to involve them. So, since when did a minor, right, who's under 18 and under the care of their parents, be sent to school and it's now their decision if their parents are involved in their life or not? Um, and then
And
down,
research has shown that kids actually do better in school when parents are more involved. And so this like flies in the face of that research too.
absolutely. And I was going to mention, we can mention it here, and probably as we go along, you'll see this again. But we were talking about how keeping secrets from parents is really not a good sign, right? And so this document is encouraging schools to ask the kids, should we keep this a secret from your parents, and so forth, and so that's really not a great sign. Do you want to talk a little bit more about that, Bridget?
Yeah. So, I mean, I do a parenting conference, and one of the things that we talk about during that conference is how to help parents train their kids to identify unsafe adults. And, there's a whole list of kind of warning signs, but one of them is the idea that if you're engaged in a conversation with an adult and they're trying to get you as a child to keep a secret from your parents or your family, that should be a warning sign to say, wait a second, maybe this is an unsafe adult. And similarly, if you're in a conversation with an adult and they start to speak negatively about your
Mhm.
family or your parents, again, that's kind of a warning sign to a child that, whoa, this might be an unsafe adult and I need to go right to my parents and tell them exactly the conversation that we've had, because it's not appropriate for other adults to be keeping secrets with kids and leaving parents out. And so I find this really concerning that here you have the New York State, basically saying to teachers and staff, yeah, we want you to do this. And yet those are unsafe practices. So I
Mhm.
find that very concerning.
Yeah, so concerning. And it manipulates teachers to see parents as the enemy, and it manipulates students to see their parents as the enemy. And so this section really talks a lot about it, family knowledge of the student transition. So some TGE, transgender, gender expansive, students have not talked to their families about their gender identity because of safety concerns or a lack of acceptance, and may begin their transition at school without parent guardian knowledge. Only the student knows whether it's safe to share their identity with caregivers and so forth. And then it says here, prematurely disclosing a student's gender identity can have severe consequences for the student. So they're threatening teachers. If you tell the parents that child might be abused, you better watch out and that'll be on you. Like it's so manipulative and so wrong. And then right after they give the abuse hotline, um, it's just so manipulative in general. parents are the loving caregivers for their children. Are there cases where there are parents who are dangerous to their children? Yes, there are, and those do need to be reported. I've unfortunately had to report some of that in my time, and it is horrible. Absolutely, the children need to be protected, but in general, that's the parent's job to protect their child. And most parents want to do that, and most parents can do that, and should do that, and should be expected to do that. And over and over again, just saying parents shouldn't know. It's the kid who knows best. Call this hotline for abuse if they're not affirmed. It's just over and over this idea, and it's really harmful.
Well, and I'll just point out too that what they're equating here is the abuse with not affirming your child. So
Yeah.
so in obviously in some cases, yeah, there is parental abuse or neglect of the children, but they are kind of blurring that line and saying if you're not going to affirm your kid, you're abusing them, and that's why this information is here.
Yeah, it's definitely that's the spirit that it gives. You're right. Yeah, even if it doesn't directly say that, to say like they concerns of a lack of acceptance, and then to give the hot child abuse hotline right after that. And then again, separating parents and their kids at a planning meeting, whether the parent or guardian attends or not, the school will want to make resources available to the student to address questions or concerns. Well, what resources? Is that going to be places where they can access hormone therapies? Probably. Is it going to be only affirming organizations? Absolutely, where they're just going to get ingrained in this belief system even more. Is it going to be participation in clubs and activities that the parents don't know about? Probably. Update student education records without the parent knowing. Again, this is still whether parents are included or not. Discuss how the student should be referred to, and how should we talk to your parents about you in written form. So again, it's asking the child, how should we deceive your parents? So this is definitely, it's concerning for all parents. If you're sending your child to school, you should be very concerned about the perspective New York State is now taking with you as a parent. And it goes on to include a line of questioning. Like if a child comes out to you as transgender, it has this line of questioning, like, have you told anybody at home? What was their reaction? Are there people who you're not ready to share that with? And then again, right after that line of questioning, make sure they're not being abused or neglected. So it's just this idea again and again, like what's happening at home, call the child abuse hotline for any child who is dealing with this issue, rather than, oh, this child is coming out as transgender. They're having these really intense feelings. And as we know earlier, suicide is higher, depression's higher, anxiety's higher, more likely to have ADHD, or people with ADHD and autism are more likely to come out as trans. So they most likely have a lot of other issues. We're going to take a child who has all these other issues and not involve their parent in a major part of their life. Yikes, this is so dangerous for children. Okay, so I just wish I could spend so much time on all this stuff, but we got to keep plugging along here. We've got pronouns and z's and zers and thems and theys that we all have to use now. Again, those that control the language are controlling the culture. So just changing slowly but surely. And I'm sure as an adult, you're experiencing this too. On your LinkedIn profile, you're being asked now to put preferred pronouns and all of that. They're not required to get parent guardian consent or a court-ordered name change or anything before being addressed by their names. So a lot of this next section goes into changing names and so forth. Essentially, the spirit of it, without spending forever in this section, is that students can change their names on anything they want, except for a few official legal documents where they might have to have an official name change to change it, like the transcript. But in student management systems and everything, it's going to have whatever the child wants. And it says school staff are responsible for ensuring students are referred to correctly. So now the school staff is responsible for monitoring that gender ideology is correctly adhered to in our schools. And we have to continually affirm the student's identity. Doing otherwise could cause stress and emotional harm. So again, teachers are now being emotionally blackmailed to support gender ideology. Otherwise, you're doing them harm. And from our other presentations, we know affirming this ideology is hurtful for the kid. So we're just completely swapping the narrative. Okay, they expect us to normalize this. So normalization is part of this being accepted into our culture. And it's one of my greatest concerns with sending kids to the public school at this point. Um, you know, is just this idea that it just becomes so normal. Whoever really speaks first and speaks most to a child is the one that prevails in that child's mind and belief system. And if that's the school, like they're going to school and they're hearing about books from the time they're in pre-K about gender and their choice of gender and using preferred pronouns from kindergarten on, and at the start of the school year, like it says here, at the start of meetings regularly throughout the year, asking them to share preferred pronouns, just gets ingrained in them that this is normal and a part of their life and a part of their culture and part of what's true. And so that normalization is very concerning. This gender-based practices now essentially is being equated with marginalization, stigmatization, stereotyping, and excluding. So we can no longer have, good morning, boys and girls. We have to say, good morning, humans or people. No assuming certain gender things. So no separating boys and girls, and that includes in gym class. No father-daughter dances, but just family dances. No prom king and queen, royal court. So we're just, instead of, encouraging people as the male or female that God created them to be and encouraging them in those roles, we are removing gender completely from anything and then saying it's meaningless, it's not associated with your sex, and it's whatever you want it to be. So that is what's happening here. We know about restrooms. We talked about that earlier. Restrooms are available to anyone based on whatever they want. So if you walk into a school in New York, you will likely still see a boys' room and a girls' room for bathrooms and for locker rooms, but that doesn't mean that they actually are girls or boys in those rooms. So those who use the rooms, it's whatever they want. So if that day a male identifies as a female, they can go in the little girl's room and that is not a problem. And it can't be, if they don't have access to that, that's discrimination to that person rather than it being harassment to the child that's being exposed in their private space. So this is something that you absolutely have to be aware of as parents.
Yeah, and I think I would just add there too, part of this is helping your child, if they go to a public school, to be able to navigate this themselves. So there are schools that do have those single stall bathrooms, and the idea would be to help your child to plan, okay, going and using that single stall bathroom, maybe it's not near some of their classes and they kind of have to plan that route and kind of plan when to do that. But all of a sudden, parents are going to have to be much more aware of, wow, I have to help my child kind of plan not only their studies and their academics, but actually navigating, school life now with all of these changes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's just also important to point out here, this includes overnight accommodation. So if your child's going on a music trip or their 8th grade field trip to Washington, D.C. or whatever, that you do not know whether a male or a female biologically is going to be in their room with them. So it's just something that you want to be overly involved with at this point with the culture of our
Parents
schools.
might have to go on a lot more field trips now and be the chaperones.
Yeah, absolutely. Or pull your kids out if you can. There's other options. All right. Let's keep going here. I see my time is waning, so I'm going to try to hurry up here. Want to talk about, again, phys ed. They're removing separated phys ed. Oh man, I don't know if I could have passed phys ed if I was not in a girls only class. Just the discomfort level I would have experienced. Okay, so this next section is one of my greatest concerns with this, just based on the research that we at Feed My Sheep have done and the presentations we've been doing over the past 2 years related to gender and sexuality and the crisis that we're having in education. We have talked a lot about the national sex ed standards and the push, especially in New York, for this to get into schools. So there has been proposed legislation over the past several years to try to get the national sex ed standards as requirement or like minimum core content. And it has not been passed. So this is not a law, yet in this legal update, they sneak it in there as if it is law. And they recommend that the national sex ed standards be used as minimum core content for K-12. Yes, sex ed in kindergarten. That's not a joke. And this includes such absurd and inappropriate, shockingly inappropriate material for kids. The fact that it's listed as minimum is just terrifying. But curriculums that align themselves with national sex ed standards show children pornography in the high school levels. The standards actually explicitly state about teaching elementary school children about masturbation, middle school age children about the use of sex toys. Like, this is not appropriate education. It's also not national. There's no federal program that developed this. This is an activist organization that developed these standards. They're LGBT and organizations mostly that have developed these standards and are pushing them into states across the nation.
I'll just mention here too that next week we're actually going to take a peek at some of these books that contain sexually explicit content, and many of these books are used as resources to go along with these comprehensive sex ed curriculums. So if you're interested in that, that's what we'll be talking about next week.
Yes, and that is something we've talked about, the national sex ed standards anyway, in previous videos and presentations. So we do encourage you to check out those conversations if you haven't already. So we've got pages and pages about school record changes. Again, just to summarize, a kid can change their name on their school records without a parent's permission. There's just certain records that might need official permission / documentation to change. But even a diploma, it says, a student can request their firm name, and that should be respected. And then that the school should tell the kid, just so you know, your parent might find out if you put it on your diploma. So again, it's just encouraging this manipulation and deception, really. Okay. Even standardized tests. A student health record should have both a legal name and their preferred name or affirmed name, as they're using now. Even special ed records, which are pretty official, and I would send those on to colleges. They're based in law, so I'm shocked. But they said that use the child's name, whatever they want, their preferred name on here. And you see here, accurate gender as asserted by the student. So not accurate what's biologically, accurate based on what the student wants is what should be on all of these different records. And then it talks about how we should have curricula that is just absolutely infused with gender ideology, and curriculum that is inclusive of different sexual viewpoints. So this is just promoting this throughout all school levels and all school classes. So this is not just coming through in sex ed by any means. This is across every subject that this is happening. And then they go and list a ton of resources. And I just highlighted one. I'm not going to show you right now because of time, but this biology is shocking, where it just removes anything about male and female, and is just in trying to incorporate gender ideology into biology lessons, which is challenging because as humans, sex is critical to reproduction and biology. And so one of the comments on that site was that because no textbook has gender affirming language, they were having the children rewrite and redraw images of textbooks because there exists nothing, because it's not based in reality or science. So there are no textbooks like this yet. I'm sure there will be soon. And so they were having children create gender neutral diagrams of reproduction. So very confusing for our children, to say the least. So that is our document. There's so much more that we could talk through, but just in the interest of time, we're going to close it out. In summary, New York State Education Department is pushing not just pushing, really forcing a religious pseudoscientific belief about gender onto all public schools in New York State, and that includes staff and students alike. They are emphatically encouraging schools to deceive parents and to deceive other staff members regarding a child's gender and their identity. New York State has removed private spaces based on sex, so that's important to know. Side note on that, if you saw the article this morning about the Pennsylvania coach who is a male and decided that he believes he is a female, and so he started changing in the girls' locker room with children and exposing himself that way. So that's what's happening. Our private spaces are removed. Girls will no longer have the opportunity to participate in sex-separated sports teams based on the advice in this document and the laws and the interpretation. And the national sex ed standards, which are horrendously inappropriate, are being recommended as minimum sex ed standards. So we have a call to action, and we ask you now to go to one of our partners, New York Families, Jason McGuire. He's got a call on his website where you can actually, let me share a new screen here, Bridget, so that people can see the website. So let me try.
Yes, and while you're doing that, Carrie, I have actually put a link to the website that Carrie is bringing up in our comment section. So you should be able to click that and go straight to the website that Carrie's about to show you.
Perfect. All right, let me try. I'll do my best here. So share screen. And I'd like to share this right here. So you should be able to see now, this is the page we're sending you to. So where Jason McGuire essentially is saying what we were saying, that this is declaring war on parents and just forcing this gender ideology. So you can follow the link here to actually write a note to Commissioner Betty Rosa of our education department about how we disagree with this and it's imposing dangerous lies about sex and gender upon students. So I've done that even though I'm not a New York State resident anymore, and I recommend you all do that as well, just to make our voices be heard about this. And we really appreciate your participation in that way. And there's more that we can do, of course. You know, really fighting this and protecting our children is the number one thing that we would ask you to do, and we pray regularly for you to do, is to take actions that protect your child. But this is one very easy call to action that we're asking you to do today, is just to make our voices be heard on this issue.
All right. Well, it looks like most of the questions have been answered anyway. And for the sake of time, since we are pretty much right at an hour here, we are just going to move on and close out. So I do just want to thank all of you for joining us tonight. And we hope that you will join us next Monday at 7 p.m. for part 2 of our Back to School series, where we will be diving into the debate surrounding books that contain sexually explicit material. So we'll be asking the question, are these books appropriate for children? And we're going to be answering that question from a research-based perspective. So we thank you all so much for joining us. Carrie, thank you so much for walking us through that document. We appreciate it. And we hope that you all have a wonderful evening.
Good evening. Bye.